Everybody that was housed here was what we called ADSEG, administrative segregation. They were locked down 23 hours a day based on their behavior at other facilities.
Normally, there would always be loud, a lot of banging, a lot of yelling.
The staff assaults at that time were typically assaults with body fluids, so urine, feces, that were thrown on the officers through the cell door.
It was a stressful place to work. It was very staff intensive.
It was very hectic. You just didn't know what you were coming into. You didn't know who you were going to have to deal with, what you were going to have to deal with.
Being that there was no, real program, it was just basically lock them down, keep them away from each other and staff to avoid any kind of incidents. But we weren't giving them any kind of incentives, so to speak. It was very limited to what they could be given or the time they could be have out of the cell, things of that nature. At the time when I came here, there was not a yard. The outdoor time consisted of a window. So obviously their hands were idle. They had nothing to preoccupy themselves with. So it left them open to their own inventions, which tended to be negative.
We'd come to work. We would start our process of taking inmates to showers, taking inmates out to the little exercise rooms that are built into the pods. We would take them back after their hour, after they had their shower, back in their cell. Everything was back and forth, very staff intensive. If the inmates needed something, we had to get it for them.
A typical day was not your typical 8-hour shift, because offenders would tend to try to act up at shift change when you're supposed to go home. That was their way of getting back to you. So typically you had a longer day than your scheduled shift because of that.
We had offenders that were released from an administrative segregation setting. The transportation staff would come into the facility. The offender would be fully restrained and escorted down to our intake area, put the offender in full restraints, put him in a van or on a bus, and then we would transport that offender to a bus station, unrestrain him, and then put him on a bus with citizens of the public. You can imagine that what the perception was, how that looked. It just wasn't a good process. So part of the reform was really taking a look at how we conduct business and what kind of processes we have in place, because essentially 97% of the offenders that are incarcerated are going to either parole or discharge. They're going to be citizens of Colorado. They're going to be our neighbors, and so we really had to look at the type of processes that we had in place and what we were doing.
Well, it was a very complex process. We had to rewrite policy. We had to bring in more programming. We had to do different infrastructure of the facility. We had to build outdoor yards, tables in the living units for offenders to sit at. And none of that stuff was here before. And it was a long process of trying to prepare.
I wasn't a believer, to be honest with you. Of course, change is always a little bit scary, knowing that the same offenders that were deemed too dangerous to be within general population were all of a sudden going to be out and about amongst staff members and each other. Of course, it's a little unsettling to think about at first, but as I slowly started to see that there was a different side of allowing these guys out, and communication amongst each other, amongst staff, the recreation that was being provided to them, you can see that it was affecting the offenders as well in a positive way. Slowly reintegrating them back to a general population setting, which is going to help them reintegrate back into society. So you started to slowly see positive changes, which made it easier to believe in what we were doing.
You always have kickback from staff that have been in that atmosphere for so long. They're just not, some people it takes them a while to get on board or something like that.
Part of the reforms is that we learn motivational interviewing, communicating with the offenders in a way that we make the experience more about them. How can they help themselves? How does this program behoove them to participate in it? How does their conduct and the way they speak to us and speak to each other, how is that going to help them in the long run? Giving them more options in regards to how they can learn just basic awareness of how to communicate with each other and us. And I think that was a learning factor both ways, offender and staff alike, because that 23-1, not only they were 23-1, but we were. That was the only kind of culture that we knew. So it was full restraints taking them out, where now they're walking right next to you. You have to have that ability to just communicate with somebody.
The process of engaging in this type of reform is well worth the effort. It's not 100% successful. I don't know if anything is 100% successful, but we have had quite a bit of success with our numbers here as far as getting them ready to progress to a less secure facility, getting them used to being around other people again, and getting them ready for progression or parole onto the streets.
There's a real humanality to this. It's not, you know, you committed a crime, you're a terrible person. You know, I think that seems to be what people may think on the outside, but when you're in here with them on a daily basis, you realize that they do have families, they do have, you know, passions, they have things that they care about that we maybe wouldn't get to see that side of them otherwise. So I do believe that that the direction that this department has gone with the changes has definitely helped staff and offenders both.
They won't be in prison forever. I mean, not everyone here is a life sentence or a long-term sentencing, so they will eventually be your neighbor. And when you want somebody that's going to be more adept to learning the acceptable social behavior.
And I have always said, if it doesn't work, we can always go back to where it was before. But the fact of the matter is, it does work.